1985, an American entrepreneur brought a small, boxy hatchback from communist Yugoslavia into the United States, priced it at just under $4,000, and called it the cheapest new car in America. For a brief, genuinely remarkable moment, this became a national sensation. Dealerships overwhelmed with buyers, waiting lists forming, magazine covers running stories about the strange little Yugoslav car that had somehow made it into American driveways at the height of the Cold War. Picture the sheer novelty of this moment for an ordinary American car buyer in 1985. The Cold War was still very much alive. Ronald Reagan was calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. And yet here, in a suburban dealership showroom, sat a brand new car, built behind what most Americans still thought of as the Iron Curtain, priced lower than anything else on the lot, with a name that sounded exotic and vaguely dangerous simply because of where it came from. People lined up. Reporters covered it as a genuine human interest story, sometimes with a wink, sometimes with real curiosity about what socialist engineering might actually deliver. For a few months, owning a Yugo carried a strange kind of conversation piece cachet, a genuinely unusual product of a genuinely unusual moment in history. Within a few years, that same car had become one of the single most mocked products in the entire history of American consumer culture, the punchline of an entire genre of jokes on late-night television, a byword for cheapness and unreliability that outlasted the car itself by decades. Comedians built entire routines around it. It became, in the American popular imagination, the answer to a very specific question: what is the worst car ever sold in this country? But here's the twist that makes this story genuinely unlike anything else we have covered across this entire series. That comedy, that punchline reputation, that commercial collapse in America was not what killed the factory that built this car. Something far more violent was coming, something that had nothing to do with reliability ratings or late-night jokes. Within a decade of the Yugo's American collapse, the very factory that built it was a literal military target, struck by NATO warplanes in an actual shooting war, its buildings reduced to rubble not by market forces, not by bankruptcy, not by a rival's takeover, but by bombs. This is the story of Zastava, the Yugoslav automaker that gave America the Yugo, and whose ultimate fate had nothing to do with jokes about reliability, and everything to do with the bloody, catastrophic disintegration of the country that built it. To understand how a car company ends up on a NATO target list, we need to go back further than any other company in this entire series, back to the middle of the 19th century, and to a country that, for most of the Cold War, refused to fit into either side of the Iron Curtain at all. The origins of Zastava trace back to 1853, when a state arms foundry was established in the Serbian town of Kragujevac, then part of the Principality of Serbia, decades before Yugoslavia itself would even come into existence as a country. This foundry produced cannons and later small arms for the Serbian and eventually Yugoslav military, developing over the following century into one of the most significant arms manufacturers in all of southeastern Europe. Kragujevac itself carries a genuinely significant place in Serbian national history, having served at various points as a capital of the Serbian state during the 19th century, and its selection as the site for the National Arms Foundry reflected its status as a genuine center of Serbian statehood and military capability. Across the following century, this foundry armed Serbian forces through wars of independence from the Ottoman Empire, through the Balkan Wars of the early 20th century, and through the catastrophic bloodletting of the First World War, in which Serbia suffered some of the highest proportional casualties of any combatant nation in that entire conflict. By the time Yugoslavia formed as a unified state after the war, Kragujevac's arms industry was already a firmly established, century-old institution, deeply woven into Serbian and eventually Yugoslav military identity. The name Zastava, meaning flag in Serbian, would eventually become globally recognized not for weapons, but for cars, though the two industries, arms and automobiles, would remain intertwined at this single facility for the entirety of its existence, a fact that would prove genuinely, catastrophically significant decades later. This deep military heritage matters enormously for understanding everything that eventually happened to this company, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Every other company we have covered in this series began as a civilian industrial enterprise: bicycles, cameras, electronics, that was later drawn into military production during wartime necessity, if at all. Zastava was the reverse. It began as a military arms manufacturer, and civilian automobile production was, from the very beginning, layered on top of an already established weapons industry. This meant that even at the height of its success as a beloved civilian car maker, the factory in Kragujevac never stopped being, at least in part, a facility that produced weapons for the Yugoslav state, a dual identity that would eventually place it directly in the crosshairs of a modern military conflict in a way no purely civilian factory in this series ever faced. To understand why Yugoslavia's automotive industry developed so differently from everything else we have documented in this series, we need to understand Yugoslavia itself, and specifically, the singular, almost improbable position it occupied within the broader communist world. Yugoslavia, under its leader Josip Broz Tito, had broken decisively with Stalin's Soviet Union in 1948, expelled from the Cominform, the Soviet-led organization of communist parties, after Tito refused to subordinate Yugoslav interests entirely to Moscow's direction. This was a genuinely unprecedented rupture. No other communist state in Europe had successfully defied Moscow and survived as an independent, functioning socialist country. Yugoslavia did exactly that, charting its own path as a communist state that remained entirely outside the Warsaw Pact, entirely outside Comecon, and entirely outside the tightly integrated Soviet-led economic and military system that bound together every other country we have profiled across this series. It is worth appreciating just how dangerous this rupture genuinely was for Tito at the time. Stalin regarded Yugoslavia's defiance as a direct challenge to Soviet authority over the entire communist world, and there were genuine fears, both within Yugoslavia and among Western observers, that Stalin might attempt a military intervention to bring the country back into line, in the same way the Soviet Union would later crush uprisings in Hungary in 1956 and invade Czechoslovakia in 1968. The very invasion that, as we documented in our episode on Tatra and Skoda, Romania's Ceausescu would famously condemn 2 decades later. Tito survived this confrontation through a combination of genuine popular support built during his wartime leadership of Yugoslav partisan resistance against Nazi occupation, a well-organized domestic security and military apparatus, and a calculated opening toward the West, accepting American and Western European economic and military assistance specifically to deter any Soviet attempt at reconquest. This entire chain of events, beginning with a single act of political defiance in 1948, set Yugoslavia on an entirely separate developmental path from every other communist state in Europe for the following 4 decades. This independence had profound consequences for how Yugoslavia's economy, and its automobile industry specifically, developed. Where East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland were locked into the Comecon system of coordinated specialization we have documented extensively throughout this series. Each assigned its particular industrial role by planners answering ultimately to Moscow, Yugoslavia answered to no one but itself. Tito pursued a policy of non-alignment, positioning Yugoslavia as a genuinely independent actor between the Soviet and Western blocs, eventually becoming one of the founding and leading members of the broader non-aligned movement, a global coalition of countries that refused to formally side with either Cold War superpower. This non-aligned position gave Yugoslavia something none of the other countries in this series ever possessed: genuine freedom to trade with and partner with Western companies without the kind of diplomatic friction or Soviet oversight that constrained similar arrangements elsewhere. When Romania struck its deal with Renault to create Dacia, as we documented in a previous episode, it was a genuinely unusual move within the more tightly Soviet-aligned framework Romania otherwise operated within. Yugoslavia faced no such constraint at all. It was entirely free to look west for industrial partnerships because it was never part of the Soviet-led system in the first place. And so, in 1953, Zastava entered into a licensing agreement with the Italian automobile manufacturer Fiat, an arrangement that would define Yugoslav automobile production for the following half-century. Under this agreement, Zastava would produce Fiat-designed vehicles, adapted for Yugoslav manufacturing and Yugoslav markets, using genuine Italian engineering and design as the foundation for what would become Yugoslavia's national automobile industry. The timing and geography of this deal are genuinely worth appreciating. Italy sat directly across the Adriatic Sea from Yugoslavia, a Western European nation with a well-established automotive industry and, crucially, a government and business community willing to engage commercially with Tito's non-aligned communist state at a moment when much of the rest of the West still treated any communist government with deep suspicion. Fiat itself was a genuinely major European manufacturer with decades of engineering experience, and the arrangement gave it access to a new manufacturing base and a new market within the socialist world, while giving Yugoslavia access to modern, proven automotive engineering without the enormous expense and time of developing an entirely indigenous design from scratch. Exactly the same fundamental logic that would later drive Romania's Renault deal, and in the very different context of post-war reparations, the Soviet Union's acquisition of German Opel tooling for the Moskvich. This Fiat partnership deserves genuine attention because it establishes a foundational pattern that would echo, in a completely different and far more violent way, decades later at the very end of this story. Just as Dacia's story began and ended with Renault, and just as the Moskvich's origins traced back to German Opel tooling, Zastava's entire automotive identity was built from the very beginning on Italian Fiat engineering, adapted and localized for production in a small industrial town in central Serbia. This wasn't a case of Soviet-style reverse engineering or forced technology transfer through war reparations. This was a genuine, mutually beneficial commercial licensing arrangement between a Western European manufacturer and a communist state that happened to sit entirely outside the Soviet system, made possible precisely because of Yugoslavia's unique, non-aligned position. Through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, Zastava grew into Yugoslavia's flagship automobile manufacturer, producing a succession of Fiat-based models that motorized the country much as similar national car projects had done across the rest of Eastern Europe. These cars were, generally speaking, more current and more directly tied to contemporary Western designs than many of their Comecon country counterparts, precisely because the ongoing Fiat relationship gave Zastava more consistent access to updated Western engineering than factories like AZLK or the early Trabant, which had been left largely to freeze in place after their initial post-war technology transfers. The range of vehicles Zastava produced across these decades genuinely rivaled the breadth of any national automobile industry we have documented in this series. Beyond its mainstream family saloons and hatchbacks, Zastava built delivery vans, light trucks, and a range of variants adapted to Yugoslav agricultural and commercial needs, becoming, much like Dacia in Romania or CKD's broader industrial output in Czechoslovakia, a genuinely central pillar of everyday economic life rather than merely a producer of private passenger vehicles. Zastava vehicles carried goods to market, ferried rural families along mountain roads, and served state enterprises and private citizens alike, weaving themselves into the fabric of Yugoslav daily life across every republic of the Federation, from the Adriatic coast to the mountains of Bosnia to the plains of Serbia itself. Yugoslavia's broader economic system also differed meaningfully from the rest of the communist world in ways that shaped Zastava's development. Tito's Yugoslavia practiced a genuinely distinctive form of socialism built around worker self-management, in which factories were formally owned and, at least in theory, managed collectively by their own workforces rather than directly by centralized state ministries in the manner of Soviet-style planning. This system, whatever its practical limitations, gave Yugoslav industrial enterprises a somewhat different character than their counterparts in the more rigidly centrally planned Comecon economies, a genuine ideological experiment in an alternative form of socialist economic organization that set Yugoslavia apart from every other country we have profiled in this series. It is worth pausing on this system in a bit more detail, because it represents a genuinely distinct ideological experiment compared to everything else this series has documented. Under Yugoslav self-management, workers' councils at individual enterprises held genuine, if bounded, authority over decisions like investment, wage distribution, and management appointments, at least in principle, a meaningfully different arrangement from the top-down ministerial control that governed factories like Robotron, AZLK, or CKD. Whether this system delivered genuinely different outcomes in practice compared to conventional Soviet-style planning remains a matter of genuine historical debate, and Yugoslav industry, including Zastava, still faced many of the same fundamental pressures around investment, technological modernization, and productivity that afflicted planned economies everywhere. But the ideological framing and the genuine measure of local autonomy it provided marked Yugoslav enterprises as operating within a meaningfully different system than anything else covered across this entire series. Yugoslavia's relative openness also meant its citizens enjoyed a level of everyday freedom that would have seemed extraordinary to citizens of East Germany or Czechoslovakia. Yugoslavs could travel abroad relatively freely, a genuine rarity within the broader communist world, and many worked temporarily in Western European countries, particularly West Germany, sending money home and returning with direct, first-hand experience of Western consumer life. This openness extended to consumer goods as well, and Zastava's cars, while still products of a socialist industrial system, existed within a somewhat less isolated, less rigidly controlled economic environment than the Trabants and Wartburgs of the Warsaw Pact states. By the late 1970s, Zastava introduced the model that would eventually carry the company's story to its strangest and most improbable chapter: a compact hatchback based on Fiat engineering that would be marketed domestically under the Zastava name and would eventually cross the Atlantic Ocean to become, however briefly, one of the most talked about cars in the United States of America. The car in question, known in Yugoslavia as the Zastava Coral, but destined to become globally famous under a different name entirely, was based on the Fiat 128 and later Fiat 127 platforms. Compact, practical, front-wheel drive hatchbacks that represented genuinely competent, if unremarkable, European engineering for their era. Within Yugoslavia, this car became a genuinely important and widely owned vehicle, the kind of practical, everyday family car that occupied a place in ordinary Yugoslav life, not unlike the Dacia in Romania or the Skoda in Czechoslovakia. A familiar, unglamorous, genuinely useful piece of everyday transportation for millions of ordinary families. For ordinary Yugoslav citizens, this car represented exactly the kind of aspirational, hard-won consumer good we have documented recurring across nearly every country in this series, a genuine marker of household stability and modest prosperity in a society where private car ownership, while somewhat more accessible than in the stricter Warsaw Pact states, still represented a genuinely significant purchase for most families. It carried Yugoslav families on holiday to the Adriatic coast, ferried children to school, and served as the reliable, everyday workhorse of a country that, whatever its looming political troubles, still enjoyed, through the late 1970s and early 1980s, a standard of living and a degree of everyday consumer choice that distinguished it meaningfully from its more rigidly planned neighbors to the north and east. But it was what happened to this car in America, beginning in the mid-1980s, that transformed it from an ordinary Eastern European economy car into one of the most genuinely bizarre chapters in the entire history of automotive marketing, and one that deserves to be told in full because it is unlike anything else in this series. In the early 1980s, an American entrepreneur named Malcolm Bricklin, who had already built and lost a career importing and creating unusual automobiles, identified what he believed was a genuine gap in the American car market: the complete absence of any genuinely new car priced low enough for the most budget-conscious American buyers. Bricklin's solution was to look behind the Iron Curtain, or in this case, to the non-aligned edge of it, and he struck a deal to import Zastava's compact hatchback into the United States, rebranding it for the American market under the name Yugo, a deliberately simplified, memorable name derived directly from the car's Yugoslav origins. Bricklin himself was a genuinely colorful figure in American automotive history, having previously attempted, with mixed results, to bring other unconventional vehicles to the American market. His instinct for identifying underserved market niches was genuine, even if his execution frequently ran into serious difficulty, and the Yugo venture would prove to be both his most successful and his most notorious undertaking, a project that would make him, for a time, a genuine celebrity of American business news coverage, and would later attach his name permanently to one of the most mocked consumer products in American history. Before the Yugo, Bricklin had already made a name for himself importing Subaru vehicles into the United States in the early 1970s, and had subsequently attempted to launch his own eponymous sports car brand, a venture that ultimately collapsed into bankruptcy after a few short years of production. This history of ambitious, high-profile automotive ventures, some successful, others genuinely disastrous, meant that when Bricklin turned his attention to Yugoslavia in the early 1980s, he brought with him both a genuine talent for generating public attention and a personal track record that made some observers within the American automotive press genuinely skeptical of whatever he attempted next. That skepticism, as it turned out, would eventually prove entirely justified, though not before the Yugo enjoyed its own brief moment of genuine commercial triumph. The Yugo launched in the American market in 1985, priced at just under $4,000, dramatically below any other new car available in the country at the time. This pricing was genuinely revolutionary in the context of the mid-1980s American auto market, and it generated an extraordinary wave of initial publicity and consumer interest. Major American news outlets covered the story with genuine fascination. The idea of an affordable new car from communist Yugoslavia landing on American shores struck a distinctly novel chord in the middle of the Cold War, equal parts curiosity, novelty, and genuine appeal to price-conscious buyers who had never before had access to a genuinely new car at anywhere near this price point. For a brief window, the Yugo was a genuine sensation. Dealerships reported overwhelming demand, waiting lists formed, and the car became a fixture of American media coverage, celebrated as proof that even at the height of Cold War tension, capitalism's hunger for a bargain could reach across the Iron Curtain and pull a communist product directly into American driveways. Bricklin's import operations sold tens of thousands of these vehicles in the car's first full year on the American market, a genuinely remarkable achievement for an entirely unknown brand with no existing American dealer network, no American brand recognition, and no track record whatsoever with American consumers. This first-year sales performance genuinely deserves emphasis because it is easy, with the benefit of hindsight and knowing how thoroughly the brand's reputation would later collapse, to forget just how commercially successful the Yugo initially was. Few automotive launches in American history, before or since, have managed to move this volume of an entirely unknown, entirely foreign brand within their very first year on sale. And for a brief period, industry analysts genuinely debated whether Bricklin had identified a durable, permanent niche in the American market for genuinely low-cost new vehicles, rather than merely a passing novelty destined to fade. But the enthusiasm did not last. As American owners put genuine daily mileage on their new Yugos, the car's underlying quality and reliability problems became apparent with brutal speed. Build quality, adequate perhaps for the more forgiving expectations and lower usage patterns of the Yugoslav domestic market, proved genuinely inadequate for the more demanding conditions of American roads, American climates, and American consumer expectations around reliability. Reports of mechanical failures, electrical problems, and genuine safety concerns began accumulating rapidly, and American automotive journalists and consumer publications increasingly savaged the car in reviews, cementing a reputation for shoddiness that would follow the Yugo name for the remainder of its existence, and long after. What followed was one of the most thorough and sustained campaigns of comedic mockery ever directed at a single automobile in American popular culture, arguably exceeding even the Skoda's decades-long run as a punchline in British comedy that we documented in an earlier episode. The Yugo became a staple reference point across American late-night television, stand-up comedy, and popular culture generally, shorthand for cheapness, unreliability, and poor quality that extended in the popular imagination well beyond the specific vehicle itself. The specific character of these jokes is genuinely worth understanding because it reveals something about how quickly and how thoroughly the Yugo's reputation collapsed. Where the Skoda jokes in Britain had developed gradually over more than a decade, building slowly into a durable cultural institution, the Yugo's transformation from novelty to punchline happened with genuinely startling speed within just a few years of its American launch. Comedians joked about doubling a Yugo's value by filling its gas tank, about its rear window defroster existing purely to keep your hands warm while pushing it, about its resale value approaching zero the moment it left the dealership lot. These jokes spread rapidly through the exact same national media ecosystem: network television, syndicated newspaper columns, radio call-in shows that had originally generated such enthusiastic coverage of the car's arrival just a couple of years earlier. The same press cycle that made the Yugo famous made it infamous, and it did so with remarkable speed. Jokes about the Yugo's supposed flimsiness, its tendency to break down, and its rock-bottom resale value became a genuinely pervasive cultural touchstone throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, repeated so frequently and for so long that the Yugo's name became, for an entire generation of Americans, effectively synonymous with the very concept of a bad car, in much the same way that certain other brand names have become generic shorthand for entire categories of shoddy products. The commercial consequences of this reputational collapse were severe and rapid. Sales of the Yugo in America declined sharply through the late 1980s, and Brickland's importing operation, along with the successor companies that took over Yugo's American distribution, struggled against mounting reputational damage, declining sales, and genuine financial distress. By 1992, Yugo America, the company responsible for importing and selling these vehicles in the United States, had ceased operations entirely, ending the Yugo's brief, strange, and commercially disastrous American chapter after fewer than a decade. It would be entirely reasonable, based on everything this series has documented so far, to assume that this is where Zastava's story in this series would end. Another Eastern Bloc automobile brand that achieved a brief moment of Western market success before collapsing under the weight of its own quality problems and the brutal judgment of Western consumers, following essentially the same pattern we have already documented with the Trabant, the Wartburg, and countless other companies across this entire series. This assumption would, in fact, describe a perfectly plausible and genuinely common fate for a company in Zastava's position, and it is worth acknowledging why it would be such a reasonable guess. By the early 1990s, the Yugo brand in America was dead, its importer bankrupt, its reputation in ruins. Had this series simply followed the money, the sales figures, and the consumer reviews, the natural next chapter would be a story of gradual winding down, perhaps a smaller, domestic-only operation, limping along for a few more years before quietly ceasing production entirely. Exactly the trajectory that eventually consumed AZLK in Moscow, or very nearly consumed Tatra before its own difficult recovery. Nothing about the ordinary economic logic of automobile manufacturing would have predicted what actually happened next. But this is not where Zastava's story ends, and this is precisely where this episode diverges from everything else we have covered. Because while American consumers were laughing at Yugo jokes on late-night television, something far darker and far more consequential was unfolding in the country where these cars were actually built. Something that had nothing whatsoever to do with reliability ratings or comedy routines, and that would ultimately determine the factory's fate in a way no market failure ever could. Josip Broz Tito, the leader who had defied Stalin in 1948 and built Yugoslavia's genuinely unique non-aligned socialist system, died in 1980. Tito had for decades functioned as the singular unifying figure holding together a genuinely diverse federation of Yugoslav republics and ethnic communities: Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, Macedonians, and others, each with distinct histories, distinct national identities, and in some cases, genuinely painful historical grievances against one another dating back generations. Tito's authority, his personal prestige, and his careful management of the delicate balance between these different communities had held the Yugoslav Federation together through decades of Cold War tension. His death removed that unifying figure at precisely the moment when Yugoslavia's economy was beginning to face genuine strain, and the underlying ethnic and nationalist tensions that Tito had spent decades managing began, gradually and then catastrophically, to resurface. It is worth understanding just how carefully Tito had constructed the political architecture designed to survive his own eventual death. Yugoslavia's federal constitution established a rotating collective presidency intended to prevent any single republic or ethnic group from dominating the others once Tito himself was no longer there to personally arbitrate disputes between them. This system, however well-intentioned, ultimately proved unable to generate the kind of decisive, unifying leadership Tito himself had provided through sheer personal authority and wartime legitimacy. Without Tito, the delicate balance between Yugoslavia's constituent republics increasingly became a matter of raw political competition rather than the carefully managed consensus he had maintained. And this vacuum of unifying leadership would prove to be a genuine structural vulnerability once serious economic and nationalist pressures began building through the 1980s. Through the 1980s, in the decade immediately following Tito's death, Yugoslavia's federal system grew increasingly strained, as economic difficulties, mounting foreign debt, and rising nationalist sentiment across the various Yugoslav republics combined to erode the fragile unity Tito had maintained. By the time communism began collapsing across the rest of Eastern Europe in 1989, the wave of revolutions we have documented extensively across this entire series, Yugoslavia was already facing its own, entirely separate and far more dangerous crisis. One rooted not simply in the failure of central planning, but in genuine, deep-seated national and ethnic divisions that the fall of communism would soon violently unleash. In 1991, Slovenia and Croatia declared independence from Yugoslavia, triggering a series of wars that would come to be known collectively as the Yugoslav Wars, a brutal, prolonged conflict that would eventually claim well over 100,000 lives across the following decade and permanently shatter the country into multiple separate independent nations. This was not the largely peaceful transition we have documented in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, nor even the violent but relatively brief revolutionary upheaval we documented in Romania. This was a genuine, sustained, multi-year war fought along ethnic and national lines, involving mass displacement, atrocities, and a level of sustained violence that had no parallel anywhere else in the former communist world during this period. The scale and character of this violence genuinely sets Yugoslavia's transition apart from everything else this series has documented, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than glossed over. What began with Slovenia's relatively brief and limited conflict in 1991 escalated dramatically as Croatia's own declaration of independence triggered a considerably longer and bloodier war, followed by an even more catastrophic conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina beginning in 1992, a war marked by ethnic cleansing campaigns, prolonged sieges of civilian population centers, and atrocities that would eventually be prosecuted as war crimes and genocide before international tribunals. This was, in the most direct and literal sense, the most violent process of political transition anywhere in the former communist world during this entire era, an order of magnitude beyond anything else this series has had to confront. Zastava's home city of Kragujevac sat within Serbia, which, under the leadership of Slobodan Milosevic, became the central power in what remained of the Yugoslav Federation as other republics broke away, and which was directly involved in the wars raging in Croatia and Bosnia throughout the early and mid-1990s. As these wars unfolded, the international community, appalled by reports of ethnic cleansing and mass atrocities, particularly in Bosnia, imposed severe international economic sanctions on Serbia and the rump Yugoslav state, cutting off trade, financial transactions, and access to international markets in an effort to pressure the Milosevic government to end the violence. For Zastava, these sanctions were genuinely devastating, in a way that fundamentally differs from every other collapse mechanism we have documented across this series. This was not the gradual technological stagnation that doomed the Trabant, nor the sudden loss of a captive export market that destroyed Icarus, nor even the chaotic but essentially peaceful economic transition that nearly finished off Skoda before Volkswagen's rescue. This was a deliberate, internationally coordinated economic strangulation, imposed specifically because of a war the factory itself had no role in starting and no ability whatsoever to influence. Export markets that Zastava had cultivated for decades, throughout Western Europe and beyond, were cut off virtually overnight by sanctions that made trading with Serbian companies illegal across most of the international community. Access to the imported components and materials the factory depended on, including ongoing technical cooperation with Fiat, became severely restricted or impossible entirely. The company that had once sold cars to American consumers found itself, within less than a decade, operating within one of the most isolated, sanctioned economies anywhere on Earth. Consider the genuinely surreal whiplash of this particular decade for anyone connected to this company. In 1985, its car had been a celebrated novelty crossing the Iron Curtain to reach eager American buyers. By the early 1990s, that same country's entire economy was subject to international sanctions specifically designed to isolate it from world trade entirely. The exact opposite condition from the brief moment of international commercial opening that had produced the Yugo in the first place. The factory hadn't changed, its workers hadn't changed, but the political world around them had inverted completely, from cautious opening to total isolation in the span of less than a single decade. And then, in 1999, the situation grew even more catastrophic, in a manner that connects directly back to the deep military heritage this factory had carried since its founding in 1853. As the Yugoslav wars entered their final major phase, centered this time on the Serbian province of Kosovo, and a brutal campaign of violence against its ethnic Albanian population, NATO launched a sustained bombing campaign against Serbia, known as Operation Allied Force, aimed at forcing Milosevic's government to end its campaign in Kosovo. This bombing campaign targeted a wide range of Serbian military and dual-use industrial infrastructure, and the Zastava factory complex in Kragujevac, given its origins and ongoing role as an arms manufacturer alongside its civilian automobile production, was identified and struck as a legitimate military target. Operation Allied Force ran for roughly 11 weeks in the spring of 1999, one of the largest sustained NATO military operations conducted since the alliance's founding, involving thousands of individual airstrikes against targets across Serbia and the broader rump Yugoslav state. NATO's targeting doctrine during this campaign explicitly included industrial facilities understood to contribute to Serbia's military-industrial capacity, alongside more conventional military infrastructure like air defense systems, command centers, and troop concentrations. Zastava's century-and-a-half-old identity as an arms manufacturer, an identity that had, for the previous several decades, existed somewhat quietly in the shadow of its far more publicly visible civilian car production, placed it squarely within this category of legitimate industrial targets. Consider the genuinely unique and almost unbearable historical weight of this moment, set against everything else we have documented across this entire series. Every other company we have covered met its end through economic forces, however brutal: market competition, currency collapse, legal rulings, internal corporate conflict, fragmented privatization. Zastava's automobile factory, the same facility that had produced the small, cheerful, endlessly mocked little car that had briefly delighted and then embarrassed American consumers just over a decade earlier, was now struck by actual military ordnance, dropped from actual NATO warplanes as part of an actual shooting war. The factory's original 19th century identity as a weapons manufacturer, the very fact that had once seemed like a distant historical footnote to its later fame as a civilian automaker, had reasserted itself with genuinely devastating consequence. The company had never fully separated its arms production from its car production, and when NATO went looking for legitimate military-industrial targets within Serbia, the factory that had once built the Yugo was, by virtue of what else it manufactured on the very same grounds, squarely in the crosshairs. The bombing inflicted severe physical damage on the Zastava industrial complex, destroying significant portions of the factory infrastructure that had, across nearly a century and a half, produced everything from artillery to small arms to the beloved, ridiculed little cars that had once carried Yugoslav families to their weekend destinations and, however briefly, carried a strange kind of Cold War novelty into American driveways. Workers who had spent careers building cars now found their workplace a literal bomb site, their livelihoods destroyed, not by the slow grind of market competition we have documented throughout this series, but by the sudden, violent intervention of an international military coalition responding to their own government's actions in a war entirely disconnected from anything happening on the factory floor. Picture the specific, visceral difference between this kind of ending and every other collapse this series has documented. A worker at the Trabant factory in 1990 watched sales figures decline and eventually received notice that the plant would close. A worker at CKD watched their division get sold off to a new owner who may or may not deliver on promised investment. A worker at Zastava's Kragujevac complex in the spring of 1999 may have heard air raid sirens, taken shelter, and returned, if the factory still stood at all, to find portions of the workplace where they had spent years of their working life reduced to rubble and twisted steel. No other company profiled in this entire series required its own workforce to survive an actual sustained military bombing campaign as a condition of the company's continued existence. This is worth sitting with directly because it represents something genuinely and uniquely tragic among everything this series has documented. The workers of Kragujevac had no meaningful influence over Milosevic's policies in Kosovo. They had not started the Yugoslav wars, had not orchestrated the ethnic violence that provoked NATO's intervention, and had no realistic ability to shape any of the political decisions that led international warplanes to their factory gates. They were, in the most direct and literal sense, innocent bystanders whose workplace happened to sit within a country whose leadership had made catastrophic decisions on an entirely different stage. Decisions that nonetheless reached all the way down to the factory floor in the form of literal explosive ordnance. In the aftermath of the NATO bombing campaign and Milosevic's eventual fall from power in 2000, Zastava faced the genuinely daunting task of rebuilding from actual physical destruction, a challenge fundamentally different from anything the other companies in this series confronted. Where Skoda needed capital and modern engineering, where Dacia needed a committed strategic partner, Zastava needed, quite literally, to rebuild bombed-out factory buildings before it could even begin to address the more conventional economic challenges facing every other former Eastern Bloc automaker. The political transformation that followed Milosevic's fall deserves genuine mention because it set the stage for everything that eventually allowed Zastava to find its own path back toward recovery. Milosevic was removed from power in October 2000, following widespread protests and an election he had attempted to falsify, and Serbia subsequently began a slow, difficult process of political normalization, extraditing Milosevic himself to face war crimes charges before an international tribunal, and gradually working to rebuild diplomatic and economic relationships with the wider world that a decade of war and sanctions had severed. This process took years, and Serbia's broader economy, of which Zastava remained a genuinely significant component, struggled through this entire period with the accumulated damage of war, sanctions, and the sheer difficulty of rebuilding trust with international partners and investors. Serbia itself, emerging from the Milosevic era and the accumulated damage of a decade of war and sanctions, faced a genuinely difficult path toward economic normalization and eventual reintegration with the broader European and international community. Zastava's automobile operations continued through the early 2000s in a severely diminished, uncertain form, producing limited quantities of aging models for a domestic market that had itself been devastated by years of war, sanctions, and economic isolation. And then, in a resolution that echoes, in genuinely striking ways, the Dacia story we documented in our previous episode, the path forward for Zastava's surviving automotive operations came from the very same company that had started this entire story more than half a century earlier. In 2008, Fiat, the Italian manufacturer whose 1953 licensing agreement had first brought modern automobile production to Kragujevac, returned to Serbia, establishing a new joint venture with the Serbian government to build modern Fiat vehicles at the historic Kragujevac site, under a new company structure that would eventually assume full Fiat ownership. Consider the genuine significance of Fiat's willingness to return to this specific site, given everything that had happened there in the intervening years. This was not a case of a Western company simply eyeing an attractive greenfield investment opportunity in a stable, growing economy. This was a deliberate decision to reinvest in a facility that had been an actual NATO bombing target less than a decade earlier, located in a country still working through the aftermath of war crimes prosecutions and a genuinely difficult process of national reconciliation and economic reconstruction. Fiat's decision reflected, in part, the same underlying calculation that had originally drawn the company to Yugoslavia back in 1953. Genuine, skilled industrial labor, available at costs considerably below Western European levels, combined with a genuinely established manufacturing tradition at this specific site stretching back over a century and a half. But it also reflected something more. A genuine bet that Serbia's post-Milosevic trajectory toward political normalization and eventual European integration represented a real and durable transformation, worth the risk of renewed investment in a location with such a genuinely traumatic recent history. The symmetry here is genuinely remarkable and deserves to be placed directly alongside the Dacia and Renault story we told previously. Two companies in two different corners of the former Eastern Bloc, both originally created through licensing partnerships with Western European automakers in the mid-20th century, both eventually rescued, decades later, by those very same original partners returning to reclaim and rebuild what they had originally helped create. But where Dacia's rescue came in response to ordinary post-communist economic collapse, Zastava's rescue came in response to something far more severe: actual war, actual international sanctions, and actual military destruction of the physical factory itself. Fiat's return to Kragujevac was not merely a rescue from market failure. It was, in a very real sense, a rescue from the physical and economic wreckage of a war. Under Fiat's renewed ownership, the historic Kragujevac site began producing modern, contemporary Fiat models for European markets, gradually rebuilding a genuine manufacturing operation on the same grounds that had, just years earlier, been a literal NATO bombing target. The old Zastava brand name and the old domestically designed models were largely retired, the factory's identity transformed once again, this time into a genuine, modern, internationally integrated component of Fiat's broader European manufacturing network, rather than the semi-independent national carmaker it had been throughout the Tito era and the turbulent years that followed. So here is where this particular story lands, and here is what makes it meaningfully, fundamentally different from every other story we have told across this entire series. Every other company we have profiled met its end, or found its salvation, through the ordinary mechanisms of economics: markets, competition, currency, corporate ownership, legal rulings, privatization. Zastava's fate was decided by something else entirely, by the disintegration of the country itself into ethnic war, by international sanctions imposed as a consequence of that war, and finally by literal military bombardment, the direct physical destruction of the factory by an international coalition's warplanes, responding to a conflict that had nothing to do with cars, comedy, quality control, or market competition of any kind. There is a genuine and almost unbearable irony worth naming directly here. The Yugo's American reputation, its status as a punchline, as the answer to every joke about bad cars, was for decades the most visible and internationally recognized thing about this company, far more widely known than anything else in its long history. And yet that entire episode, as dramatic and commercially consequential as it was within America, turns out to have been almost entirely disconnected from what actually determined the factory's ultimate fate. The Yugo's American failure was a story about consumer expectations and quality control. The factory's actual near destruction was a story about ethnic nationalism, civil war, and international military intervention. An entirely separate catastrophe that happened to befall the same physical buildings and the same workforce, for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with the joke Americans had been telling about their cars for the better part of a decade. This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth drawing out as a closing thought, because it reframes the entire American Yugo story in a genuinely humbling way. When Americans laughed at Yugo jokes throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, they were laughing at a car built by workers in Kragujevac who were, within just a few years, going to watch their own country tear itself apart in war, their own city become a target of international bombing, and their own livelihoods threatened not by a punchline, but by actual bombs. The joke and the tragedy happened to the same place, the same factory, very nearly the same people, but they were, in the end, almost entirely separate stories, connected only by the strange coincidence of a small Yugoslav hatchback that happened to cross the Atlantic Ocean at exactly the wrong, or perhaps exactly the right, moment in its country's history. There is a broader lesson here too, one that applies well beyond this single company's story, and that connects back to a theme this entire series has circled from its very first episode. It is genuinely tempting, when examining these industrial giants from the outside, to reduce each one to a single, tidy narrative. A car that failed because of poor engineering, a company that collapsed because of bad management, a brand that became a joke because it deserved to be one. Zastava's story is a genuine caution against this kind of reductive thinking. The Yugo's reputation for poor quality was real, and it genuinely shaped the car's commercial fate in America. But the deeper fate of the company that built it, the survival or destruction of the actual factory, the actual jobs, the actual community built around it, was decided by forces that had absolutely nothing to do with that reputation at all. Sometimes the joke and the tragedy are simply two entirely different stories, unfolding in parallel, and it takes real effort to hold both of them in view at once without letting one obscure the other. 14 industrial and commercial giants now, all built somewhere within, behind, or, in Yugoslavia's genuinely singular case, entirely outside the tightly bound Soviet system that shaped everything else we have covered in this series. And 14 genuinely different endings. And this one, uniquely among all of them, is the story of a company that survived a punchline, survived a stock market crash of consumer confidence, survived the ordinary economic chaos of post-communist transition, and was ultimately undone not by any of that, but by literal warplanes, dropping literal bombs on a factory whose deepest, oldest identity, dating back a century and a half before its most famous car was ever built, had never really stopped being what it originally was, a maker of weapons, caught, in the end, in an actual war. Let us know in the comments which Iron Curtain industrial giant you want us to dig into next, and subscribe, because there are plenty more of these stories still waiting to be told.